Good morning. Isn't Bible camp a good thing? Having all these kids, young folks, learning so much. And congratulations, Sister Kinley. And I was glad to receive that text message and find out about that. You know, the Bible tells us a lot of things about love, but the one chapter that we find in Scripture, 1 Corinthians chapter 13, talks again and again. In fact, its entire focus is on love. And this morning I want to share with you the transition verse, or one of the transition verses in this chapter, 1 Corinthians 13 and verse 6. To understand love, and we're talking about that agape sacrificial love, we need to understand sometimes what love does not do. In this text, we find that a man would bestow all his goods, verse 3, to feed the poor, and though I give my body to be burned, but have not love or charity, it profits me nothing. And then it goes into this little bit of two verses where it says love suffers long and is kind. Love, and then it goes right back into the opposite. Does not envy. Love does not parade itself. Is not puffed up. So the understanding Paul is trying to get us to receive here is that the fact that love does things and agape love doesn't do some things. And so in verse 6, when you get all the way down to it, it's understood that love, in verse 5 it says, does not behave rudely, does not seek its own, is not provoked, thinks no evil. And now verse 6, love does not rejoice in iniquity. And that's what I want to focus on. But the transition is right there. There's a three-letter word, but rejoices in the truth. That's a huge word in the Bible, isn't it? B-U-T. It's a lot like the word A-L-L, all, or is, or for. Little bitty words throughout God's Word that show us and express great meaning. Well, this is one of those times. Love does not, it's understood that love does not rejoice in unrighteousness or iniquity, but, and this is what it does, it rejoices in truth. And I want us to focus on that today. I want us to examine what love does not rejoice in and how we can understand what it really means. 1 John 3 and verse 4 says, whoever commits sin also commits lawlessness, and sin is lawlessness or a transgression of the law, isn't it? Sin is breaking God's law. And so I'm sure there's nobody here this morning in this audience who's ever rejoiced in something that was horrific, or how we would define terrible. There's probably no one in here that's ever rejoiced in a murder, in the unrighteousness or iniquity of murder. There's probably no one in here who's ever said, well, that was a good thing that happened to an innocent child, an abuse to a child. Nobody's ever rejoiced in something like that. There's nobody in here, I'm sure, that's ever rejoiced and said, I'm really glad that person never obeyed the gospel. Isn't that great? That's not the level of rejoicing in iniquity I think Paul's talking about. We think, well, if rejoicing in iniquity, well, he means, what we would define as the big sins. Well, there's no big sins, but we would define them that way. I want us to narrow that down a little bit and see how it is possibly that we do sometimes out of ignorance, not just not knowing, or out of the simple fact that sometimes we can reason in our minds something, and we find that if you really look at it, we're rejoicing in iniquity. I was talking to a young man about modesty not long ago, and in fact we covered some of it in class today. And the discussion was about how it is that girls ought to dress and boys ought to dress, and so I guess it was on my mind, so I brought it up in class today as well, and we talked about it some, and we talked about water parks and things like that. And I've always looked at it like this. I can go to some of the big grocery stores, and they can sell some things I don't agree with, and I can go in there and I can shop at those grocery stores. I can go down all the aisles, and maybe I skip maybe I skip the magazine aisle, or maybe I skip some of the beverage aisles, and you just imagine what's on the beverage aisles, and still like that store. So that's what I'm talking about as Christians. We can do some of those things. I can appreciate a store and some of the qualities of it, but that's a worldly thing. But when you look at this world and all the iniquity in it, it's hard for us to not... It's a fine line to live in it and enjoy this life. We're told to enjoy this life and not rejoice in iniquity. Let me explain it this way, I guess. There was a movie several years back that I was so excited to see. I mean, I was just upside down. I'm not a movie person. I like going to the movies once in a while. It has to be a spectacular movie for me to want to go to the movie theater. And in fact, lately, in the last few years, it's been something my children wanted to go see, and that's the only reason kind of that we'd even go. But this movie had me excited. I couldn't wait to see it. Went to see it, and I'm not going to give you the title, but we went to see it, and it was a great movie. I mean, just well made. The action scenes were right. And then there were just these few parts where some really strong language was used. And there was another part that had some promiscuity, lasciviousness, whatever you want to call it, some scenes you don't want, children to see or you don't want to be part of watching. And so I saw some of these things in that movie, and I thought, but that's such a great movie. It was so awesome. And so I went around, people would ask me, hey, have you seen that movie? And I'd say, oh, man, that was a great movie. But you can't, you got to worry about this scene and that scene, and there's a few parts. Is that not rejoicing in iniquity to some degree? Now, I thought it was a great movie, but didn't those scenes, those few parts of that movie that were lawlessness, as John talked about, and here I am promoting the movie, and it's absolutely in contrary to God's will. That's the kind of rejoicing in iniquity I'm talking about. Now, I still, like I said, I go to stores where they sell things, and I watch movies sometimes that have scenes in them and things that, I say, I really don't want to be part of that. But I'm also careful about not rejoicing in it. I can say it's a good movie without rejoicing, because there's a difference in saying something's nice and in saying something's awesome, right? There's two different categories there. And so Paul's talking about not rejoicing in iniquity. So it's very easy for me to understand how we can fall into that category with a movie like that. So, well, that's an awesome movie. When really, it was a pretty good movie. It had some drawbacks. There's two different aspects of that, isn't there? There's two different ways of talking about something like that. I know I had I used to think about, I guess in high school, anybody ever have that bully that in high school, their name is imprinted on your brain? That guy or that person, that maybe a teacher, whatever it was, that person that you thought, boy, they just never give me a break. They're going to get their comeuppance, right? We can rejoice sometimes in that. I remember someone in my life that I thought, they're going to get theirs one day, and for a long time, I thought, well, that's when that happens, I'm going to rejoice over that in my mind. I didn't say rejoice, but I thought I'm going to be happy when they get theirs. Love doesn't rejoice in iniquity. Love is not happy they got caught. Love is saddened that they got caught. Saddened that they were involved in that type of lifestyle. I think it's the old saying that, we have to love the sinner and hate the sin. So I want us to look at some things this morning and not rejoice in iniquity. Not rejoice because someone got their comeuppance. Not rejoice because a movie's really awesome despite some lawlessness, some sin. I can still be happy about some of those things. In fact, have you ever heard a person talk about their past and they say, oh man, back then I was this, I was that, and I could do this and I could do that. And they're talking about sinful things, and they look back with a sense of admiration instead of a sense of sadness. Love does not rejoice in iniquity. Point number one, love is saddened by sin. In a book called Catching the Light, the quotation comes from Arthur Zonak. He writes and describes that the entwined history of light and mind, and as he's talking about this, he describes as by one admirer as the ultimate or two ultimate metaphors of the human spirit. For our purpose, I want to look at this one chapter that he writes in here, and I'm just going to read portions of it. He says, for both the animal and the human studies, we know there are critical development windows in the first years of life. Sensory and motor skills are formed, and if this early opportunity is lost, trying to play catch-up is hugely frustrating and mostly unsuccessful. Professor Zonak writes of studies which investigated recovery from congenital blindness. Thanks to cornea transplants, people who had been blind from birth would suddenly have functional use of their eyes. Nevertheless, success was rare. Referring to one young man, he said, the world does not appear to the patient as filled with the gifts of an intelligible light, color, shape upon awakening from surgery. Zonak observed light and eyes were not enough to grant the patient sight. The light of day beckoned, but no light of mind replied within the boy's anxious, open eyes. Zonak quotes from a study of Dr. Moreau, who observed that while surgery gave the patient the power to see, the employment of this power, the ability to use it, which was a whole, constitutes the act of seeing. So basically they had eyes that could work, function, but they couldn't see. The act of using that organ, the eye, was not something they could do. And so just to give back sight to the congenitally blind person is more a work of education than of surgery. To which Zonak adds, the sober truth remains that vision requires far more than a functional physical organ. Without an inner light, without a formative visual imagination, we are still blind. He explains that inner light, the light of the mind, must flow into and marry with the light of nature to bring forth the world. Just having eyes that work wasn't the key to fixing or causing or correcting someone's blindness. I must know how to use what God has given me. Now, let's put that in perspective spiritually. Love causes me to see sin properly. Love causes me to see sin properly. You know, we change the names of things in order to be able to make them palatable, make them something we can understand. We call abortion, we call it pro-choice, or we say that we never use the term murder. We never use the idea of a baby being aborted. We talk about a fetus. Well, a fetus doesn't sound very baby-like, does it? So we change the name of it, and then it's palatable. I can stand to say it. But if you talk about killing a baby, it's an entirely different thing. And so when you look at this world we live in, we need to have a mindset that is saddened by sin. Look at Matthew chapter 6, beginning in verse 21. He says here, for where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. The lamp of the body, talking about our eyes, is the eye, and therefore, if your eye is good, your whole body will be full of light. But if your eye is bad, your whole body will be full of darkness. If, therefore, the light that is in you is darkness, how great is that darkness? True love has 20/20 vision. True love is not blinded to the fact that sin is sin. True love is not blinded to the fact that every person who ever sins has a soul, and the consequences of that is being lost. And any action or effect they've had on you in this world, it's not that important. Any consequence to that action, though, spiritually is of great importance. So sin, if a person truly has agape love, sacrificial love, they're saddened by sin. People usually sin because of weakness to do what is right, not because they just don't know any better. Oscar Wilde wrote, "A friend will stab you in the front." You ever found out not only is someone that loves, when they see sin, they ought to be saddened by it, but someone who truly loves you will be honest with you when you have sin in your life. Love is someone that will stab you in the front. Proverbs 27 verse 6 says, "Faithful are the wounds of a friend." I had a man tell me just this week, he was asking me about something, and it was questionable in his life whether it was right or wrong. And he asked me, and I told him the truth. And he said, "I knew you'd tell me the truth." And I thought about this sermon, and I said, I want to be a good friend. You asked, and I told you the truth. I did it lovingly, but I told him the truth. Love does not rejoice in morality. Love does not rejoice in someone else's sin. Love or immorality. Love does not rejoice in someone's sin. It's faithful to God, faithful to the person we're talking to. We can reason a lot of things. Man often reasons away conditions of the heart. Proverbs 14 verse 12 tells us that there is a way that seemeth right to man, but the end thereof is the way of death. How many couples have said, well, we love each other, and they're reasoning away some act of immorality or sexual sin or promiscuity, maybe cohabitation. A girl once told me, talking about modesty, she said, if they're looking at me the wrong way, it's their sin, not mine, as she wore entirely inappropriate clothing. She failed to see that her immodesty was helping cause the situation. We can reason a lot of things. Because I'm somewhere where everybody dresses immodesty, well, that makes it okay. I ought to be able to dress immodesty too. I guess one of the best things I've ever seen, I saw a little clip of it on the internet, was a father with his daughter, and they were at a pool, and she had some boys over, and there were some other girls, and they were all out in little bikinis and this kind of thing, and the father stepped out there, and he was talking to him, and they were probably 13, 14, 15-year-old kids, and he just, it was extreme, but he had some boxer shorts on, and he started taking his shirt off while he's talking to him, and the girl's going, what are you doing? Wait, whoa, Dad, put your clothes back on. Put your shirt back on, Dad. And he's still talking. He starts pulling his belt off, and he starts pulling his shoes and socks off, and they're just sitting there talking. And the girl's like, Dad, what are you doing? You're embarrassing me. Get out of here, And he never got what you would consider completely immodest, but he made his point very well. He said, what's wrong? I just wanted to wear my boxers around here. Y'all are wearing the same things. Made a good point, didn't he? We have to be considerate of what we're doing in this world. And we have to be careful with how we reason things out. One man said the power of reason will destroy countless souls eternally. Some choose ignorance over truth and error over truth. I recently saw this thing on Facebook, and it was one of those things I had to save it. It went like this. It said, don't let your daughter wear makeup at 10, date at 12, wear provocative clothing at 14, and wonder why she's pregnant at 16. Pretty pointed, isn't it? Love does not rejoice in iniquity. This was an assigned topic to me. I went to Glenwood and preached this. And I actually taught about an hour on it, and I'm trying to cut that hour down into about 45 minutes, or that 45 minutes down into about 25 minutes. So I'm leaving out a lot, but this topic, when I read the text there and really looked at it and thought about how we get involved in iniquity and don't even realize we're doing it, myself included. You find things, you say, well, it's okay, it's the norm, it's culture. And then before long, I'm even maybe promoting some of those things. And I want us as Christians to wake up and to think about what we're promoting, what we're calling awesome, instead of just, well, that's a pretty good movie, it's got some questionable things. Or that's an awesome movie, and don't even tell them about the stuff you need to worry about. With technology now, there ought not to be a movie that we go to that we don't research. And I'm the worst. There's so much opportunity to take 5 minutes and get on the internet and look at some of the websites that tell you about a movie before you ever go to it, and you can know whether or not you ought to take your children. I'm always neglecting to do that. I don't always do it, but I need to do it more. One writer said, when one follows self, talking about reasoning out things, there's no room for God. When one follows self-will, there's no room for God. I need to be more like Paul when he said in Galatians 2 and verse 20, I have been crucified with Christ. It is no longer I who liveth, but Christ lives in me. And the life which I now live in the flesh, I live by the faith in the Son of God who loved me and gave Himself for me. That says it all right there, doesn't it? I can't rejoice in iniquity. I need to rejoice in truth. It's our duty to be angry at bad things, wrong things. Not the people necessarily doing them, but be saddened that that person's involved in that, but angry at the devil, angry at sin. Because Christianity ought to be down to the very core of who we are. So much so that when you see sin, it ought to make you angry. And I don't mean at the person. I mean that it's out there. I wish that was gone away. I wish abortion was gone away. I wish promiscuity was gone. I wish all temptations and sins alike were gone away and we could just wipe them away. That would be a wonderful thing. Wouldn't be anything wrong in the world. But we wouldn't have a choice then to show God how much we love Him. We wouldn't have a choice to do what verse 6 says in 1 Corinthians 13. Does not rejoice in iniquity, but watch the back part of that. But rejoices in truth. You know, if there wasn't all of the negative in the world, we couldn't appreciate the positive. We couldn't appreciate the wonderful things that we have. We need to rejoice in truth. You know, finding out that someone's obeyed the gospel. Finding out that someone has been restored to the church. Somebody has said, you know, I haven't been doing it right. I need to do it right. That ought to cause us to rejoice. That's awesome. You know, we use that word flippantly. Awesome. Well, that's awesome, man. That's awesome. That's a very biblical term. When you think about God and you're in awe of something, it ought to be God and God's workings. I ought to rejoice in truth. Meaning I take the time to study and I devote myself to what God wants me to be. Psalm 119 verse 35 says, make me walk in the paths of your commandments, for I delight in it. It's delightful. Same chapter, verse 77 says, for your law is my delight. Verse 174 says, I long for your salvation. That's rejoicing in truth. I long for your salvation, O Lord, and your law is my delight. Rejoice in truth. Rejoice in His church. Come to VBS not this week, next week. And when we're having VBS and these kids are delighting in the songs and in the lessons and in the crafts, rejoice in the truth that's being taught. Rejoice in the memories they're making. Make sure your children are involved with that. Rejoice in truth. It means I'm going to put myself in the right place. Psalm 1, the first 3 verses says, blessed is the man who walks not in the counsel of the ungodly, nor stands in the path of sinners, nor sits in the seat of the scornful, but his delight is in the law of the Lord, and His law He meditates day and night. He shall be like a tree planted by the rivers of water that brings forth its fruit in its season, whose leaf also shall not wither. And whatever he does, he shall prosper. Love is not ignorant. Love knows that sin ought to be saddening, and love knows where rejoicing ought to be in truth. A faithful life devoted to God. As Paul said, living for God, not living for ourselves. That's rejoicing in truth. Are you rejoicing in truth? Do you have truth in your life to the degree that you've obeyed the gospel? You said, I'm not going to live for me anymore. I'm not going to transgress God's laws. I'm going to do what's right and live faithfully. That's rejoicing in truth. Have you found yourself, you find yourself not living as you should, and maybe it's because you've never obeyed the gospel, and you're so attached to the world, you love the things of the world. Maybe not, I'm not saying you enjoy murder. I'm not saying you like it when people are lost. I'm not saying you love abortion or drugs or terrible things, but you just like the world. God says there's enmity therein. There's a separation when you love the world. And if I am promoting the world, if I'm living in this world saying it's wonderful, it's great, yeah, there's some problems, but this is really great. Folks, there are a lot of problems, real problems in the world. And I can't rejoice therein. I can't rejoice in iniquity and unrighteousness. There are people in this town who are lost, and we need to reach out to them. I need to rejoice in truth. And it starts in your life, in your relationship with God. Rejoice in that truth. Do away with iniquity. If you've never obeyed the gospel, do so. Be added to the Lord's church. Such as should be saved. Christ adds you to the church. He did it daily in the first century and still does it today. Maybe this morning you find yourself, you've obeyed the gospel at some point and you said, I once rejoiced in truth, and maybe I'm not rejoicing as I should. Maybe I've let the world get back in there a little bit. Make it right. Make a change. If you have a need this morning, let me encourage you to come as we stand and as we sing.